morning, everyone, and welcome to the Korea Society. Excuse me. I'm Tom Byrne, the new president of the Korea Society. I think I can get away with saying that until I've been here for 100 days. It's about 60 right now. But today it's a real pleasure to have Kathy Stevens here. Kathy currently is a fellow at Stanford and the acting director of the Korea program there. Kathy was ambassador to Korea from 2008 to 2011. And back in 1975 to 1977, Kathy was a Peace Corps volunteer in Korea. To her left, as you're looking, is Stephen Norper. He's the director of our policy programming department here at the Korea Society. And I'd also like to note we have another former ambassador to Korea sitting right here in the front, Ambassador Don Gregg. Don Gregg was the longest serving president of the Korea Society, to my knowledge, until 2009. And he also was U.S. ambassador to Korea from 1989 to 1993. Two housekeeping items I'd like to mention. First is that we're initiating a program evaluation system, and we handed out forms to you. We'd appreciate it if you would fill that out. And second, I'd like to welcome all members who are present of the Korea Society. And I'd like to encourage those who aren't members to join the Korea Society. And you can see Nikki over here for any of that. And then lastly, please turn off your cell phones. Thank you.
Thank you, President Byrne. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to those viewing or listening online. Welcome, Ambassador Stevens. Delighted to have you here on the stage at the Korea Society, and delighted to speak with you about new strides in Korea-U.S. relations, especially on the heels of the summit meeting between President Park Geun-hye and President Barack Obama. And I guess we could open with that, your take on the recent meeting and the accomplishments and show of unity.
Well, Steve, thank you very much. And first, I do want to say thank you very much for the invitation to come here. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very honored by the presence of all of you here today, in particular the board members. I've newly joined the Korea Society board and look forward to working, and of course, Don Gregg, Ambassador Gregg, for all his great work, both as ambassador and as leader of the Korea Society. And I also have to do a shout out to Mrs. Snyder, wife of the first ambassador to Korea I met way back in 1975. She doesn't remember, but she hosted a beautiful Christmas party and invited a few scroungy Peace Corps volunteers, of whom I was one to it, and I'll never forget it. So thank you all for coming so much. Yes, I'm delighted to be here to talk with all of you, and I very much welcome the fact this is a conversation, not a monologue on my part, or in some ways even a dialogue, although we can start with that. But I enjoyed watching the coverage of President Park's visit to Washington. It concluded just last week. My caveat again before I begin is, as you know, I am no longer a member of the U.S. government, and I was not in any of the meetings. So maybe like many here, I watched as an interested observer of Korean affairs, and did have a chance actually earlier this week at Stanford to host the current U.S. ambassador to Korea, Ambassador Lippert, who did give us a bit of a readout, and I'm not going to try to represent him here, but those are my sources of information on the visit, along with what I'm sitting on my lap, which are some very long documents. You know, one thing I've noticed, and I take it as maybe both a sign of the increasing depth and breadth of U.S.-Korean relations, as well as perhaps just our greater verbosity as as governments and as diplomats, but whereas like the 1953 armistice, or actually alliance agreement between the Republic of Korea and the U.S. I think it's about 1,000 words, and a very important document. Out of this summit alone came two lengthy statements. I mean, one that's particularly lengthy is about shared values, new frontiers. I think you gave this the title New Strides. I think that was before we heard New Frontiers. But it's long, and I'm not saying that to be critical. Actually, I hope we get into it. There's a lot in there that represents how much this relationship has deepened and broadened thanks to the great work of many people in this room, and something that I've been fortunate enough to witness, along with Tom Byrne, your new president, who, like me, was a Peace Corps volunteer way back in the day, almost 40 years ago in my case, in Korea. In any event, in terms of the visit, of course, President Park, it was her second bilateral visit, I believe, to the United States since becoming president. She's been here even more often. I know she was in New York earlier this fall to speak at the 70th anniversary of the UN Charter, with which, of course, the Republic of Korea has a very special and deeply felt relationship. But her visit to Washington was very much, I think, in the spirit of furthering the work that has gone on between successive governments in Washington and Seoul now over some decades, and I think that the fact that they issued these statements, one, I mean, rather unusually, and again, we'll get into the substance on North Korea, is a sign of the importance that I think both Washington and Seoul attach to working as closely as possible on what has been and continues to be an extremely difficult and important issue, that of finding a path to reconciliation and a better future, and indeed unification on the Korean Peninsula. And secondly, looking at the regional and the global dynamics in which our two countries are doing so much together.
On the first issue, then maybe we'll tackle both. With North Korea, there had been a lot in advance, motivated by what some people were concerned about relative to a North Korean test, either a missile launch or a nuclear test. That hasn't happened to date. That had not happened before. That did allow the two to make the statement about not recognizing North Korea as a nuclear state and show unity.
Well, I think they would have made that statement regardless.
Yeah, sure. But in terms of the level of attention, it perhaps received a bit less level of attention. Clearly, U.S. is involved with a lot of other foreign policy issues, Syria dominant among many. But how do you feel in terms of the positioning relative to North Korea and relative to those concerns about missile or
Well, maybe
nuclear
just a couple of
development?
comments. I mean, one is I think the fact that there was a separate statement issued indicates that it was of great importance at this summit to affirm that Seoul and Washington are committed to coordinating as closely as possible, both in terms of deterrence and defense, and also in terms of finding a diplomatic way forward. And I thought it was significant that they used the words, we are committed to addressing the North Korean nuclear problem with utmost urgency and determination. I mean, there has been, I think, some criticism of the use of the word strategic patience, that maybe it's a little bit too patient. And in the meantime, it's allowed North Korea to build its nuclear arsenal, and some questioning of whether the sanctions and the defense approach was accompanied with a similarly robust diplomatic effort. So I take this sense of urgency in it expressed by both leaders as a sign that, and I hope North Korea will take it as Pyongyang will take it as a sign that there is a readiness to engage, on the basis of agreements made earlier over the years about what a different future for North Korea would look like, a future where of lessened tensions with the South, of reconciliation, of economic assistance, and of course of denuclearization. How we'll get there remains a big challenge, but I think it's important. The other thing I think is really kind of that I've been watching over, and I want to mention in this group over the last couple of days, are these photographs of the most recent family reunion between the now very aged separated families who were able to make some contact. It's a sadly, obviously diminishing number. And, I saw one press report that said it was heartwarming. Well, to me, it was heartbreaking. And, when you talk about the passage of time and why we can't be patient, and when you talk about human rights, I mean, the human rights of millions of people who were separated on the Korean Peninsula 70 years ago through no fault of their own. And then for these 70 years, unlike I have to say in divided Germany, unable to have any contact with each other. It's outrageous that this has continued for 70 years, and those photographs also say to me, we must hasten the day when not only can these remaining family members find some peace in finding each other, but where this situation doesn't go on. So I don't really I hope that this is not a back burner, and I think that. The fact that the two presidents chose to highlight their attention to the issue is something that needs to be built on.
Let me ask you about what some people have considered to be some subtext about the United States and South Korea uh, providing some room for South Korea, both in terms of China,
Hmm.
where a lot of news reportage stated that the United States was very concerned about Park Geun-hye's going to China, being pictured with Putin, being pictured with Xi Jinping, and U.S. officials stating publicly and privately that that isn't a U.S. concern,
Hmm.
that we have a comfort level because of the strength of the alliance. And secondly, is there a subtext of allowing or encouraging space for inter-Korean relations, perhaps giving some room to see if constraint around testing or permitting family reunions doesn't allow the two Koreas to move forward in dialogue?
Well, I think, and I'd be interested as we get into our discussion to hear other views in this room, and indeed yours, Steve. But I think that if we now that I'm out of government, out of the day-to-day stuff, as I try to step back, if I say what has kind of shifted over the last decade or more in terms of the issues on the Korean Peninsula and how Washington and Seoul approach them, I think thing that is a positive is that the level of trust between Washington and Seoul has increased. And secondly, that along with South Korea's uh, democracy, along with the transfer of power between parties who've all pursued their own Korean policy, there's been a recognition in Washington that the road to progress on the Korean Peninsula needs to go through Seoul, and that the United States has a very, very important role to play, obviously, for historical reasons as allies, not only in providing defense and deterrence, but in finding a diplomatic solution. But that we need to respect and work closely and indeed look to Seoul to play a very, very important and indeed in many ways a leading role. And that inter-Korean, so my sense is in Washington, I certainly personally very much support the anything that can be done to strengthen the inter-Korean element of efforts vis-a-vis North Korea. With respect to the Republic of Korea's relations with China overall, and more specifically, President Park's diplomacy in that regard, I think she's been quite explicit about it. She certainly, I mean, certainly left me in no doubt, and I've obviously, knew her before she became president, of the commitment she has to the U.S.-Korea alliance. And she also has been very, very clear that building a relationship with China, as indeed the United States is trying to build a modern relation with China, is important to Korea. Certainly to the efforts to address North Korea, but also to Korea's broader interests. And I think President Obama was pretty clear about that. I mean,
Mhm.
that's a natural thing. I would also say now that, again, I get to kind of pretend to be an academic, um, I do think it's important to look at, without going into a big lecture about it, things in a somewhat broader historical context. Um, Korea and China have been neighbors, right, forever. They have a long history together. And actually, Tom Byrne and I wrote a lecture last night where a quote that was attributed to Henry Kissinger, I don't know if it's his quote or not, was something like, history is to states as character is to people or to individuals. That I think we as Americans, as we look at relationships within Northeast Asia and certainly relations between China and Korea, need to have an understanding of the historical context. And my sense of the historical context is one, China has been developing its relationship with China for a long, long time, and it's had its ups and downs. But through it, Korea has certainly maintained its own identity and a fierce sense of its own path, but has found a way to have most of the time, not always, a pretty positive relationship with China. Now, in the Republic of China, we have a modern state that is a global middle power with and a tremendously successful, very different kind of relationship with China. But within that historical context, I'm very confident in the ability of South Korea's democracy, South Korea's political leadership, and its people to have a very robust and healthy relationship with China that's going to certainly be in the interest of the U.S. in terms of a stable, secure region, but also something that I hope will over time contribute to resolution of and reconciliation on the Korean Peninsula.
Um, Kathy, you mentioned a second area, which was that of new frontiers and of global issues and
Not my
cooperation.
words, but
I know that the idea of United States and Korea working together on global issues was really very much a hallmark of your time as ambassador, of your successor, and has been a very successful theme and a reflection of the reality of Korea tackling a lot of issues. And we did hear President Park Geun-hye speak very eloquently here in New York over the course of 5 addresses during the United Nations General Assembly session on different issues of global importance.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you have some thoughts on how that has come together in your time since being ambassador.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think during my time in the U.S. government and previous and after, I mean, what we've seen is first of all, mostly a result of Korea's own success as an economy, as a trading economy, its success as a democracy, its success in addressing development issues. So I think it was a natural thing for the United States to see that. One, to encourage Korea to continue, and if you like, to build on its economic success. Remember, I mean, Korea, even way back in the day, in the 60s and 70s, was reaching out to the rest of the world in terms of its trade and its economic ties with some of the most difficult parts of the world, the Middle East, for example. Now they're building on that in terms of addressing other global issues and being a provider of other kinds of global goods. That's a natural thing for it to do. And as we look at it from the U.S. point of view, we find that the kinds of interests and efforts that Korea makes in other parts of the world are very much consonant with our own, because we do share values, because we do share an attachment and an understanding of the importance of an open trading system, of human rights, of addressing environmental issues before they become even worse.
Mhm.
So I think that has been and continues to be an area of deepening real cooperation. I mean, as a former Peace Corps volunteer, it gives me particular satisfaction to see some efforts that began around the time that I was ambassador to work together in the developmental area really blossom now and be a huge focus not only of Korea's work with the United States, but with the United Nations and with other agencies, to see the way that Korea has taken on leadership positions in areas like climate change, nonproliferation, reforestation is a part of that, which, by the way, they've been very successful at, and which would be, I think, a good area to work with North Korea in, for example, and China and beyond. And that's happening, but now they're doing it on a global scale. I would say, I mean, this is, I guess, a general editorial comment. I mean, what's interesting is that South Korea has been, I think, very successful and continues to be very successful in terms of putting real substance behind its aspirations as a middle power, as a global power. I just came back earlier this year from serving 7 months at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, to see the Republic of Korea's presence there, not only in terms, this is very important, of its businesses there. That's kind of has been the engine to drive it, but also now in terms of other forms, if you like, of Korean soft power and of Korea as a model in some ways looked by the new government in India for how to approach things like rural development. Obviously, very, very different circumstances, very different time, but nonetheless, a sense that Korea can play a role in that. So I think that is a big frontier, and
Mhm.
space is a new frontier and in some ways not so new, but one that is now being really deepened. And I noticed that President Park went to visit the NASA facilities in Goddard while she was in the United States most recently, and I think that's a sign that we'll be doing more in that area, more in cybersecurity. Ripped from the headlines. I mean, we both have some pretty strong interests in trying to strengthen our capabilities in that area, and it just makes sense to work together.
Mm. And thank you. And your eloquent words really provide a great entree for the fact that we have Ambassador Oh Jun here at noon on Monday at the Korea Society to talk about Korea's leadership in ECOSOC and the global
Right,
development goals
right, yeah.
going forward. If I could ask on this issue of your having served both in Seoul and most recently in India, um, clearly you are a tremendously popular ambassador and a very keen analyst, and now academician with Stanford. What goes into this process for you personally and professionally of looking at the region, and what makes for good analysis?
Analyze the analysis.
Mhm.
Um,
It's something we do in this series, is talk a little bit
yeah,
about what makes for a good read.
yeah. Well, I guess I actually already kind of alluded to it earlier in the sense that I actually think that uh, an attention, a kind of a rigorous attention to understanding context and history and culture is very important. And I do think that, I realize that history has become, in a way, kind of a word that makes everybody nervous because then it makes people think of, sort of disagreements that get in the way of our diplomatic work. That's a challenge. Uh, but I think that it's just a fundamental, and we're that without a better sort of understanding of context, and that's what you get from language, I would say as well. You're not going to have good policy or good analysis. Um, when it comes to Korea, and again, I guess I kind of alluded to this earlier. Now I'm thinking, I think that we as Americans, as American analysts, need to be mindful that we can't see everything, if you like, through the lens of the United States only. I mean, obviously, we are going to develop our own policy on the basis of how we see our interests and our values. But I think that just trying to, it's as simple as seeing it, from the other person's point of view. And I think when it comes to one of the most challenging analytical problems in the world, that of North Korea, that becomes especially important. And I certainly, as don't claim to understand North Korea, but I approach analysis and comments about North Korea with some skepticism, I think,
Mm.
because I think we all have to be very, very mindful and humble about how limited and narrow our kind of perspective is on it, and just need to try harder. One, I think, is to understand history and culture and mindset, and how how North Korea, if we can, perceives the world, for example, how it perceives its
Mm.
relationships, how China perceives it, and I think that will help us understand a little bit better um, what motivations there are, and why certain actions occur that sometimes we tend to dismiss as either, well, I mean, crazy or just plain evil or whatever. We really have to, not I mean the rationale or justification, but really trying to develop one, good analysis, and then two, policy options, when sometimes, I mean, none of the policy options are all that great, but
Mm.
we need to try to do the hard work of coming up with, the least bad option, and keep at it.
Mm. Recently, you spoke at Harvard University as part of the Kim Koo Foundation 10th anniversary commemoration at the Korea Institute, alongside Ambassador Stephen Bosworth and Ambassador Sung Kim. And I asked you at the time, and I'd like to ask you again here, if you were addressing next generation scholars or next generation analysts,
Mhm.
what would you tend to advise them in terms of how they shape their views? Is there a different type of approach than perhaps that of uh, the days of our training or our educational backgrounds that might allow them to strike at more important issues or develop solutions or creative approaches that perhaps we've been slower at?
Yeah. Again, I think I have a certain bias, if you like, for kind of on the ground experience. It comes from my years as a foreign service officer. I think, notwithstanding all the technology in the world and everything else, there's no substitute for meeting someone,
Mm.
eating food together, trying to speak a common language together, trying to sort of develop those relationships. I think that's important, whether you're an analyst or just a kind of a day-to-day, business person or diplomat. I do think that a potential advantage that maybe we have now that wasn't so apparent some years ago is first of all, I mean, in terms of Korea, the growth of Korean studies as a field,
Mm.
and the greater interchange between Korean scholars, at least in this case, South Korean scholars and American scholars. So I think that, and not just in the academia and scholarly community, but also in the analytical community within government and think tanks and so on. I think that's something we can really build on, but we need to figure out maybe, I mean, I've gone to a lot of, and the one at Harvard wasn't one of them, and this isn't either, but, a lot of sort of academic exchanges or policy discussions where it's people get a little, this is the other, kind of tied to, especially on some of these issues having to deal with, say, China or the Korean Peninsula and its future, to things that, shall I say, identify one with a certain political camp or another. And I think that constrains good analysis and good policy sometimes. Not that you can't have those views, obviously, but I just think there has to be some ways of, and I would say both in Korea and here, of kind of opening up the aperture a little bit, to see, given that particularly on some of the most difficult analytical problems like North Korea, we haven't had a lot of success. Kind of opened up a little bit to see, is there a way of identifying a more bipartisan way forward? So I'm straying, I guess, into politics from analysis, but I think that one does obviously influence the other.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Thanks. Before I turn to the audience, if I could just ask a final question, and that's really about your personal background and its foundation toward your professional and public service. And I was reminded the other day by Bob Mowry of Harvard that you both share some Kansas roots. We know that you have Montana.
No Kansas.
No Kansas. Then sorry, I misunderstood. But Montana.
Arizona.
Arizona. There we go.
You New Yorkers, I know. It's all.
But Montana,
whatever.
For sure. The Korea Society went to the University of Montana, and we were reminded of
Michael Mansfield.
Your time there at the Mike Mansfield Center, exactly. And so, about Montana, now you're out in beautiful Palo Alto. Is there a part of growing up and spending time in the American West that is contributing maybe to your outlook, to your worldview, to a take that
Well, I mean, maybe in a personal sense, yeah. I mean, I grew up in kind of a quintessentially, at that point, I guess you'd say, sort of American pioneer families, because my predecessors just kind of kept moving west, and so the notion that when I was 19 years old that I would, if you like, go further west and go to Hong Kong for a year didn't really sort of strike anybody as odd. I went to Hong Kong. I tell people before I ever came to New York, it was my New York, I guess I could say, and was very life changing for me. And so those young people out there, I think those experiences still can be, really, really formative. But I went in a year. I mean, this is again confirms how old I am. When it was the year that Nixon went to China. So I went from a campus, like every campus, was really, riven by debate over the Vietnam War. All the young men at that time I knew were either coming back from Vietnam or trying not to go or trying not to get drafted. My father and my uncle, fought in the Pacific. My uncle died in Kunming. My other uncle fought in Korea. And I came from, and I thought, even for someone in Arizona, Asia actually matters to us. I didn't know anybody Asian, but it actually matters. I mean, look how much it influenced my family. And then, and to see that, as I was in university, looking around at the world, we didn't have relations with China. And then we have a president who goes. So that's what stimulated my interest. That's kind of what got me going. And then, once it sort of lights the fire, that's it, And that, in some ways, is then what took me to Korea, because I really wanted to deepen my experience, my understanding of Northeast Asia. Going to China at that time was not an option, and that's what brought me into the Foreign Service. Although I also, and this is really true, I think that the real reason I took the Foreign Service exam, it's a little bit different now, but to get into the Foreign Service, is my ad for joining the State Department, you have to take a written exam, and now it's online. You can take it a few times a year, but at that time it was once a year. It was in December, and if you were overseas, it was given at the U.S. Embassy. So I had arrived in Korea in the summer of 1975, so 40 years ago, and it was getting colder and colder in this, little teacher's room where I was spending like 14 hours a day in the Korean countryside, and, kind of trying to figure out how to, sort of divide my time there, if you like. And I realized that Koreans really respected people who studied for exams. So I decided I'd study. Well, I'd study for the Foreign Service exam, which basically comprised of trying to find a Time magazine. We also had lots of pages ripped out because this is the area. You'll remember this too, Tom, of censorship, very heavy censorship in Korea. But it gave me kind of an excuse to read my Time magazine assiduously, and then get permission to not work on Saturday. We used to work on Saturdays too. And go to Seoul to the American Embassy, where sometimes they'd allow us to buy a hamburger and get a number 2 pencil and take the exam. So I feel like I'm also a product of the Korean passion for taking the goshi,
Wonderful.
And it also gave me standing in the community, as this young American woman, if I could pass the test, then that would show that I was bringing success to the town. You see, so I thank Korea for my for my diplomatic career.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming, especially our board members and our members. And those who aren't members, please consider joining and supporting us for excellent programs like we have this morning. And of course, if you filled out your evaluation form, Nikki is over here too, or our staff back there to receive it. So thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Tom. Thanks, Steve.